Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about how foreign-born or even locally born foreign people of foreign extraction gifted, through affirmative action, gifted seats in the British Federal Parliament, and how they aggressively and frequently make speeches where they champion the causes of their own racial diaspora. Now, given that there are people from the Indian subcontinent, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, all over the place, and Africa, China, the list goes on of people that are being brought into Britain from very different and very distinct cultures. And when they arrive in Britain, they want to recreate their own culture, their own third world, the vibe and the atmosphere and the look and the feel and the touch and the smell of and the corruption and the and so on of their own cultural diaspora and the origins of the cultural diaspora. Now, given that more than a quarter of the people in the British Parliament are actually not British, they're either foreign-born or first-generation British, as in first-generation British-born. But it doesn't say they speak with an English accent and they have some English mannerisms and they wear, Western suits and that sort of thing. But when they get up to speak, they talk about the issues affecting their own racial cultural diaspora. They don't talk about issues that affect Britain or Britain generally or the population generally. They specifically focus on the issues of their diaspora. Now, some of this is because these migrant groups cluster in particular areas, so they have the numbers to not necessarily elect one of their own, but in some cases they do. But they will vote and act and behave and agitate purely along racial lines, and so or racial cultural lines. So the politicians coming into the parliament are sort of imbued with those attitudes, I guess, and their continued presence in the parliament would probably require them to do that. So they're bowing, if you like, to the real politic of racial politics. But let's just look at this for a little bit more. Now, let's go a little bit deeper and drill down a bit further. People now who are at ministerial level, so the very senior levels. Now, I appreciate that the globalists control all the Western governments, and these politicians are just puppets that aren't making decisions, and they get told what to do. I get all that, but coming back to these people in the executive suite, if you will. Apart from being, very simple-minded, a lot of them. Apart from being that, when they get up to speak, they represent or claim to represent or purport to represent, again, their racial diaspora. So here's a senior minister in the government whose parents black people came from the Caribbean, and he claims to be representing Caribbean peoples, not only in this current generation, but going back hundreds of years. He is the champion of people going back from 500 years ago who were black and this and the Caribbean and that, and once were slaves and so on. And he's in the British Parliament. He's been given a taxpayer-funded salary and all sorts of benefits and perks and travel and this, that, and the next thing. And yet he's claiming to represent the slaves of 500 years ago. Because he's black and they were black, and so what's going on here? You're a member of the British government in Britain representing the British people. That is your job. That is what you are paid to do. You're not paid to represent some ideological nonsense from many centuries ago. Now, that's one example, but there are many such examples. There was a recent case where I think it was Pakistani politician. I think he's locally born, or at the very least came to England at a young age. But I'm pretty sure he's locally born, and he claims to represent Pakistani culture. which includes all sorts of behaviours such as first cousin marriage. And his argument is, well, the first cousin marriage thing should be allowed to stay because that's our culture, my people, my people. And he constantly refers to my people. Well, hold on. You're British born and you're in the British Parliament representing the British people. Your people are the British people. Isn't that why you wanted to be in? No, I'm not in Parliament to represent the British people. I'm here to represent the interests of my racial diaspora and culture. That's what I'm here for. And I was kindly gifted an affirmative action, diversity, equity, inclusion position in Parliament by the Uni Party that's controlled by the globalists. So the globalists are deliberately and willfully and aggressively, I would argue, inserting racial politics into national parliaments, federal parliaments, congresses around the Western world, and then pivoting. Once they've inserted those people, they then pivot to all the white people in the parliament are racist, Nazi, fascist Hitlers. Well, hold on a minute. You window dressed the whole thing. and then now you're creating it's the white people are the racists when you've inserted these race hustler grifter activists into the parliament. So now it goes on. So again, just sort of to give you the scale of this, more than a quarter of the people in the British Parliament claim now and they're unabashed and unashamed in making speeches, claim to represent just their own racial diaspora and nothing else. And they'll, all the black people will pick a different sort of splinter issue of the black diaspora. So I represent this bit and that bit. So it's clearly coordinated. There's no random act of just stupidity or something here. It's clearly a coordinated arrangement. But this is what they do. So of the 600 odd, I think 650 off the top of my head, parliamentarians in Britain, pushing now 200, getting on for 200, not quite 200, are representing racial sectional interests. Now, on top of that, you've then got the ideology of, gay, lesbian, trans, gender. So you've got the feminist hustlers, and they get up to say, well, I represent women. I don't represent Britain. I don't represent the British national. I represent women. I represent lesbian women. I represent black lesbian women. I represent trans lesbian women, and so on. I represent the oppressed women of such and such. And so you've got, and if you look at the number of women in Parliament and a number of people of non-British origin in Parliament, British Parliament, then more than half, in fact, decently more than half the politicians in the British Parliament don't represent Britain. They represent ideological, racial, cultural interests that are beyond or outside of the remit that the Parliament or that the politicians effectively have. Why import a problem and then make it a problem, a bigger problem, and say you represent that problem when it's been imported and created in the first place? Now, this comes to when you get people from outside of sort of the racial structure and cultural structure of your country, then or your people, then there's difficulty in assimilation and integration, particularly if the numbers coming are large, and particularly if the difference is great. Third world Islamic country to first world Christian country. That's a big leap. So why would you bring those people in? Why would you bring in and create what's obviously turned into a huge problem? And why would you then purport to represent those specific interests when those interests are against or run against the wishes and the benefits of the majority? Why should the British taxpayer fund the many deformed children that are born from first cousin marriages? Why should that be funded? Why should the white taxpayers be forced to fund, and so on? So you can come up with a whole lot of questions out of this. But where people come in that are similar of culture and heritage and So, for example, Poland, and I'll do another video on this actually, but Poland brought in somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million Ukrainian alleged refugees. Now, these Ukrainians were, as I understand it, mostly from Western Ukraine, which wasn't affected by the war. So I don't know, as in there weren't military operations in that area, but they decided to leave. I think a lot of the men wanted to escape the draft, that sort of thing. But anyway, they came to Poland, and from what I understand, well, it hasn't been perfect. The assimilation worked fairly well. The languages are similar. Many of the people around that Ukrainian-Polish border area spoke at least some Polish. A lot of the Poles in the eastern part of Poland spoke, Ukrainian, Belarusian languages and dialects and that sort of thing. So they were all white, they were all Christian, they were all, and so they could be put to work fairly easily and could fit in fairly easily. Again, not that it was 100% perfect in every way. It wasn't. when you look at the issues and the problems in assimilating the Islamic refugees or migrants into the West, there's been nothing but a problem. Whereas this was by comparison, especially when there was that many came in a very short space of time. If you look at the assimilation and the smoothness with which it was done, it's a masterclass in refugee assimilation. But the difference here was, even though millions came in quickly, the difference here was that they were all very similar people, similar views, similar attitudes, similar languages, similar cultural habits. There weren't any huge differences or material differences to cater for. So that worked quite well. When the mass migration was going, or what you would call at the time, mass migration going on in Australia, say in the 1960s, a lot of those people were British, white British. And in fact, that was the Australian advertising at the time was, bring out of Britain, was the immigration catch cry at the time. Well, why? That's because they were Nazi racist. No. It's because they were the easiest and quickest to assimilate. They were the government had to spend the least amount of money to get the most amount of return. These people could get jobs. There was an emphasis on skilled. If you look at the people coming into Australia from Britain or anywhere for that matter, could be Western Europe generally. The proportion of skilled people was quite. But there weren't a few labourers and so on. There were, but the proportion of skilled people was quite remarkable compared to today. You look at a ship's manifest of an immigration ship, and they were, they had nurses and carpenters and bricklayers and architects and and so on. So those were the sort of people. All of them could walk off the plane or the ship and pretty much walk straight into a job. Now, not every single one of them was skilled, and there were still people from countries where they didn't speak English, Italy, for example, and so on. But a lot of those people still had some sort of a skill, like they were concreters or stonemasons or something. But compared to today, where the masses of people coming from the Indian subcontinent and wherever else, so they've got no skills at all. And they struggle, to find employment outside of affirmative action programs. So very different. But coming back to the assimilation thing, why do these people, and remember they're affirmative action gifted these seats, so the Uni Party gifts it to them. They go to a local, Pakistani racial agitator, come grifter stirrer, and say that we'll give you a seat in Parliament. And it's effectively buying them off, I guess, but that person is then there to represent or purports to represent Pakistani interests or African interests or Caribbean interests, or whatever it might be. Now, why the British Parliament and the Uni Party would condone it, because they're creating problems for themselves. But how many generations of British-born does it take before you think you represent Britain or you perceive yourself as British? And if you come to another country to live, not on a short-term work visa or as a student, which is quite different, but if you come to the country to live and you decide, no, I just want to live just the way I did, and I want my kids and grandkids to live just the way I did in Pakistan, then why should those people be permitted to stay? Sure, if you want to live, just like you did in Pakistan, fine. There's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want. But then you need to go to Pakistan to do that. You're now in Britain, and you're a second or third generation British born. You now are British. If you don't think that, then you need to consider going, or you should be denied any position in the public service or in government. That's another option here. Now, there are some who say that, well, if you have to be, your grandparents, for example, should be born in Britain, and your parents and you should be born, and that's enough to make you British. I don't know that it is. I look at 5 and 6 generations of Indians that are Western born, and they still say, no, I'm Indian. They will only marry other Indians. They will send back to the village of their ancestors for brides and husbands. Their children, every year they go to India to instill in the children the Indianness of their existence. And so they're not, they don't look at them. They want all the benefits of living in a rich society or first world society, but they very much want to maintain that cultural and genetic purity, and don't want to dilute it at all, unless they're getting something for it. They'll happily take white people's money, but they won't share it with white people. They're very reluctant to do that, and will only do it if there's just no other option. So I don't know if these people ever assimilate or integrate or ever perceive themselves as being British or Australian or American or whatever it is. Now, some do, of course, but the issue arises rather that in order to represent the people of any given country, you have to perceive you are a member of that society. Not a specific special cultural diaspora splinter group of that society, but that society. And if you don't perceive that and don't see yourself in that light, why should you be allowed to have taxpayer-funded governmental positions? And I don't care whether it's local governments or regional or federal, or should those people be allowed to do it? So there should be I believe there should be some sort of as soon as someone gets up in Parliament and says, I represent the Pakistani diaspora, my people, I represent Black Caribbean, my people. So the second they get up to say that sort of thing, they're evicted from Parliament. You don't represent the British people or the people nationally. You don't represent, if you think you represent sectional interests like that. Now, you may, others have sort of discussed this online, that, well, what's the difference between a parliamentarian that may, say, be in the pocket of the big banks, for example, or in the pockets of big business or the pharmaceutical business? What's the difference? This guy's just saying, well, I represent, Pakistan, whereas another politician might get up and say they represent the concerns or the issues around, say, new legislation that might be coming out on financial or pharmaceutical. That's not the same thing. We're talking about a British-based firm. We're talking about that employs tens of thousands of people, and they have legitimate concerns over that. Should be all transparent, by the way, and not done in the back channels. But so I don't see that as the same thing at all. When a politician gets up and says they represent Black Caribbeans, they're saying these people don't integrate, don't want to integrate, don't want to be part of the show. They just want eternal handouts and victim this and so, and I represent them. And you can't come to the table and negotiate with people like that because they're ideological rather than, at least the pharmaceutical firms, whatever you may think of them, or the financial firms, you can still do a degree of horse trading. Well, I'll give you this if you give me that. And that brings people closer to the middle rather than making them go further apart. So these are issues that also should be considered. But again, coming back to the original point of this essay, is that more than half the British Parliament now represent specific racial, cultural, and ideological interests, and do not represent the national interest. Now, I don't know whether going back in if someone's been 10 generations British born, does it make any difference? Look at how Tony Blair and David Cameron and those guys, Theresa May, how casually and easily and aggressively they sold out the British people, and the lies they told. Yeah, we're going to cut immigration, and they tripled it instead. All these sorts of, they constantly lied and deceived and engaged in my view, endless duplicity in dealing with the British electorate. And they went back many generations British born, and yet again they gagged and couldn't wait to sell out the British people. So I don't know if going back generations is enough in itself. In my view, there needs to be some sort of independent test that these people believe that anyone that wants to hold public office at any level must declare that they represent the British people. And the minute they don't, and get up to make some sort of speech, but I represent Black Caribbeans, or I represent my people, and this sort of stuff, then they're evicted from Parliament. And I think it needs to be that stringent. Now, once you introduce some sort of a monitoring system like that, there'll be those, cynically, who will come along and try and abuse it, or stack the deck, or mark the cards, and so that would need to be guarded against. But again, while the uni-party machine is going out and finding these race grifters, hustlers, to give them jobs in Parliament, that could be an area to also look at. But until a federal national parliament represents the nation and its people, then it will always be a useless rabble, which I would argue is the case in Britain and other Western countries today. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.